1793. The air in Corsica was thick with rebellion. A young Napoleon Bonaparte, barely 24, stood at the edge of a battlefield, his eyes burning with ambition. France was in chaos. The monarchy had fallen, and revolutionaries were carving a new future. But for Napoleon, this was an opportunity. Born into a minor noble family, he had always been an outsider. Mocked for his accent, belittled for his small stature. Yet, in war, he found his true calling. His mind was sharper than any sword, and he understood one thing better than anyone. Power belonged to those who seized it. His first real test came at the siege of Toulon, where the British had taken control of a French port. With strategic brilliance, Napoleon outmaneuvered seasoned generals, leading a daring attack that drove the British out. The victory was electrifying, and Paris took notice. He was promoted to brigadier general, an unheard-of feat for someone so young. But success breeds enemies, and the political tides of the revolution were treacherous. A single misstep could mean the guillotine. Paris was a city of paranoia. The reign of terror had claimed thousands, and alliances shifted like sand. Napoleon knew that survival meant more than winning battles. It meant understanding the game of power. He distanced himself from extremists, aligning with moderates who saw in him the future of France. When a royalist uprising threatened the government in 1795, Napoleon crushed it with ruthless efficiency, earning him the trust of the ruling directory. He had proven himself indispensable. Yet he was restless. France was still unstable, and he saw himself as the only man who could bring order. His next move? Italy. The country was a mess of warring states, and France needed a strong leader to conquer it. Napoleon took charge of the ragtag French army, transforming them into a force of discipline and determination. What followed was a campaign unlike any other. Against all odds, he defeated the Austrians and reshaped Europe's balance of power. But his ambition was far from satisfied. Napoleon's victories in Italy made him a legend. Yet he knew that fame in France was fleeting. He needed something greater, a conquest that would place him above all. Egypt, the land of pharaohs, the gateway to the East. He convinced the Directory that by seizing Egypt, France could cut off Britain's trade with India, dealing a massive blow to their empire. In 1798, he set sail with a grand army, dreaming of carving his name into history. But Egypt was no easy prize. The deserts were merciless, the enemy relentless. Though he won stunning battles, including the famous Battle of the Pyramids, disaster struck at sea. The British Navy, under Admiral Nelson, annihilated the French fleet, stranding Napoleon in a foreign land. Yet, even in failure, he found opportunity. He studied the ruins, embraced the mystique of the East, and presented himself as a scholar warrior. Back in France, however, the government was crumbling. Sensing his moment, he abandoned his troops and secretly returned to Paris. A new plan was forming, one that would make him not just a general, but the master of France. The First World War was a turning point for the British Empire. Britain, along with its allies, emerged victorious. But the war left deep scars. Millions of soldiers had died, and the economy was struggling. The colonies had played a crucial role in Britain's victory. Indian, African, and Australian soldiers had fought on the front lines, believing that their sacrifices would earn them greater rights and freedom. But when the war ended, Britain's response was disappointing. Instead of granting more autonomy, the empire tightened its grip. This led to anger and resentment, especially in India. where movements like Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent resistance started gaining momentum. Britain was now facing a new kind of enemy. Not foreign invaders, but internal rebellions demanding independence. While Britain was busy handling unrest in its colonies, another storm was brewing in Europe. The rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany dragged the world into another devastating conflict, World War II. This time, Britain was at the center of the fight. The empire once again relied on its colonies for soldiers and resources, promising freedom in return. The war drained Britain's economy even further, leaving it in massive debt. But more importantly, it exposed a harsh truth. The British Empire was no longer invincible. The illusion of power had been shattered. In 1947, Britain finally had to face reality. After years of struggle, India gained independence, marking the beginning of the empire's collapse. The loss of India sent a strong message to other colonies. If India could break free, so could they. Over the next few decades, the empire crumbled. One by one, African and Caribbean nations gained independence. The empire that once controlled a quarter of the world was now shrinking rapidly. But Britain wasn't ready to completely let go. To maintain some influence, it formed the Commonwealth, a group of former colonies that would remain loosely connected to Britain. However, this was not the same as having an empire. The world had changed, and Britain was no longer the superpower it once was. Yet, even as it adjusted to this new reality, another major shift was on the horizon: the European Union. As Britain adjusted to life after the empire, it faced a new challenge: its place in Europe. The Second World War had left the continent in ruins, and European nations realized that unity was the key to rebuilding. This led to the formation of the European Economic Community, EEC, in 1957, a group of 6 countries aiming for economic cooperation. At first, Britain hesitated to join, still clinging to its global identity rather than seeing itself as just another European nation. But as its economy struggled in the post-war years, the idea of joining the EEC became more appealing. After 2 failed attempts, blocked by France's President Charles de Gaulle, Britain was finally accepted in 1973. However, this decision would spark debates that would last for decades. Joining the EEC was supposed to boost Britain's economy, but not everyone was convinced it was the right move. Many saw it as a loss of sovereignty, arguing that British laws should not be influenced by European rules. This division was evident in the 1975 referendum, where the British people were asked if they wanted to stay in the EEC. The result was a strong yes, with 67% voting to remain, but the debate didn't end there. Over the years, Britain's relationship with Europe remained complicated, while other European nations moved towards deeper integration. Forming the European Union, EU, in 1993, Britain kept its distance, refusing to adopt the euro and demanding special treatment. This half-in, half-out approach created tensions, both within Britain and with the rest of Europe. By the 2000s, the EU had grown significantly, and so had the criticisms within Britain. Many believe that immigration policies, trade rules, and financial contributions to the EU were harming the UK rather than helping it. These concerns were amplified by politicians and the media, making the EU seem like an unwanted burden. In 2016, after years of debate and pressure, a referendum was held. The British people were asked once again, should the UK stay in the EU or leave? The results shocked the world.
52% voted for Brexit. Britain had made a historic decision to leave the European Union, setting the stage for one of the most controversial and chaotic political events in modern history.
Napoleon had power, but it wasn't enough. He had built France into a disciplined, prosperous nation, yet he remained just a consul, a temporary leader. That wasn't his vision. He wanted permanence, legitimacy, a title that would put him above all others. The people already saw him as their savior, the man who had restored order. But Europe was still restless, and as long as kings and emperors ruled elsewhere, France could not be truly secure. In 1702, he made his first bold move, declaring himself consul for life, a clear step toward monarchy. There were whispers of ambition, concerns of tyranny, but the public overwhelmingly approved. After all, under Napoleon, France was thriving, roads were rebuilt, the military was stronger than ever, and the chaos of the revolution was finally over. Yet, Napoleon knew that being a lifelong ruler was not enough. He wanted to be crowned, not by the people, not by politicians, but by God himself. The time had come for an empire. 1804. The Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris was packed with France's elite. The Pope himself had traveled from Rome to crown Napoleon as Emperor of the French. The world watched, expecting the traditional ceremony where the Pope would place the crown upon the ruler's head, symbolizing divine authority. But Napoleon was no ordinary man. As the moment arrived, he did the unthinkable. He took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. The message was clear. Napoleon owed his power to no one, not to God, not to the church, not to fate. He was emperor because he had seized the throne himself. It was an act of pure dominance, a declaration that France was now an empire under his absolute rule. The crowd erupted in cheers, but behind the celebrations, the tension was rising. Europe had tolerated Napoleon as a military leader, but an emperor? That was a threat no monarch could ignore. War was coming, and this time it would not be fought for France's survival. It would be for Napoleon's legacy. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia formed a coalition, determined to crush Napoleon before his power became unstoppable. But they underestimated him. He had built an army like no other, a force driven by loyalty and an unbreakable belief in their leader. The first real test came at Austerlitz in 1805, a battle that would define Napoleon's genius. Outnumbered, facing a combined Russian and Austrian force, he played a psychological game. He pretended to be weak, retreating strategically, luring his enemies into a trap. Then, at the perfect moment, he struck with devastating precision. The enemy was annihilated, the battlefield littered with their dead. Austerlitz was a masterpiece of warfare, proving that Napoleon was not just a ruler. He was the greatest military mind of his time. Europe was shaken. Kings and emperors who had mocked the little Corsican now feared him. Napoleon was no longer just a French leader. He was the master of the continent. But one enemy remained, untouchable, undefeated: Britain. And for Napoleon, as long as Britain stood, his empire was incomplete. Napoleon had crushed Austria and Russia at Austerlitz, proving his dominance on land. His empire stretched from the Atlantic to the edges of Prussia, and Europe trembled at his name. But across the English Channel, Britain stood defiant. The British Navy, led by Admiral Nelson, controlled the seas, making it impossible for Napoleon to invade. France's army was unmatched, but without a fleet, crossing the water was suicide. Napoleon hated the British with a passion. He saw them as arrogant merchants. hiding behind their navy while funding his enemies. He knew that as long as Britain remained untouched, his empire would never be complete. So he devised a new strategy. If he couldn't defeat Britain in battle, he would choke its economy. In 1706, he issued the Sonning Continental System, a decree banning all European nations from trading with Britain. He believed that if he could cut off British goods, their economy would collapse and they would surrender. It was an ambitious move, but one that came with risks. Controlling Europe's economy meant controlling its leaders, and not all of them were willing to obey. The continental system quickly caused chaos. French-controlled territories were forced to stop buying British goods, but smugglers found ways around it. Countries like Spain and Portugal resisted, secretly trading with Britain. Napoleon, furious at their defiance, decided that if diplomacy wouldn't work, force would. In 1708, he marched his troops into Spain, deposing the Spanish king and installing his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as ruler. But the Spanish people refused to submit. Instead of traditional battles, they waged a brutal guerrilla war, ambushing French troops, cutting supply lines, and vanishing into the countryside. Britain seized the opportunity, sending troops under the command of Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, to support the resistance. The Peninsular War had begun, and for the first time, Napoleon faced a war he could not control. His soldiers were used to direct confrontations, not unpredictable hit-and-run attacks. The Spanish War drained France's resources, and despite his victories, Napoleon found himself stuck in a never-ending conflict. But the worst was yet to come. As Napoleon struggled in Spain, trouble was brewing in the east. Russia, once an ally, was growing restless under the weight of the continental system. Their economy suffered from the ban on British goods, and Tsar Alexander I resented being treated as a subordinate. By 1812, Napoleon sensed betrayal. He knew that if Russia broke the blockade, others would follow. He made a fateful decision, one that would become the turning point of his reign. He would invade Russia. It was the largest military campaign in history, with over 600,000 French soldiers marching toward Moscow. Napoleon believed that a quick, decisive battle would force the Tsar to surrender. But Russia was unlike any enemy he had faced before. The land was vast, the weather unforgiving, and the Russian army refused to fight directly. Instead, they retreated deeper into the country, burning everything behind them. Napoleon chased them for months, his army suffering from hunger, exhaustion, and disease. When he finally reached Moscow, he expected victory. Instead, he found the city in flames, abandoned. There was no triumph, only a deadly trap. The Russian winter was coming and Napoleon had no way out. Moscow burned as Napoleon stood in the ruins, realizing the depth of his mistake. The Russians had refused to surrender, sacrificing their own capital to deny him victory. He waited for weeks, hoping Tsar Alexander I would negotiate. But no message came. Instead, the brutal Russian winter arrived. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and food supplies ran out. His once mighty Grande Armée, over 600,000 strong, now faced starvation and disease. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers froze in their sleep, and desperate men resorted to eating their own fallen comrades. Napoleon, usually a master strategist, had underestimated the sheer brutality of the Russian terrain. He had won battles, but he was losing the war. Not to the Russians, but to nature itself. With no supplies and no shelter, Napoleon had only one option: retreat. In October 1812, he gave the order to withdraw, leading his men back toward France. But the Russians were waiting. They launched relentless attacks on the retreating army, using the land to their advantage. The Battle of the Berezina River was a massacre. Thousands of French soldiers drowned trying to cross, while Russian artillery tore through their ranks. The retreat turned into a nightmare. By the time Napoleon's army staggered back to Poland, only 50,000 men remained. Over 500,000 had been lost. The greatest disaster of his career. For the first time, Napoleon was vulnerable. The myth of his invincibility was shattered, and Europe saw its chance to strike back. As news of the catastrophe spread, Napoleon rushed back to Paris, fearing a coup in his absence. He still had power, but his grip was weakening. His enemies, sensing blood, formed a new alliance: Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, all united to destroy him. In 1813, Napoleon assembled a new army and fought back fiercely in Germany, winning battles but losing ground. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. Outnumbered and surrounded, Napoleon fought desperately, but the odds were too great. His forces were crushed, and for the first time, he was forced into retreat. Not just from a battlefield, but from his empire itself. The war had turned against him, and soon the fight would reach his doorstep. France was no longer on the offensive. Napoleon was now fighting for survival. 1814. The once mighty French Empire was crumbling. Napoleon had returned to Paris, exhausted but defiant. He still believed in his destiny, still thought he could turn the tide. But reality was closing in. The coalition armies, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, were marching toward France. They had learned from past mistakes, refusing to give Napoleon the chance to rebuild. His allies abandoned him one by one, sensing that his reign was coming to an end. Even his most loyal generals began questioning whether the war could continue. France, once willing to follow him into any battle, was now weary of constant war, heavy taxes, and endless sacrifice. The magic of his rule was fading, and his enemies could smell his weakness. In January, the Allied forces invaded France. Napoleon, still a master tactician, fought a desperate campaign, winning small battles against overwhelming odds. He moved faster than his enemies, outmaneuvering them at every step. But he was fighting a war he could no longer win. His resources were depleted, his army too small. On March 31st, the unthinkable happened. Paris fell. The city that had crowned him emperor now opened its gates to his enemies. The coalition leaders, standing in the heart of France, demanded his abdication. Napoleon refused at first. He still dreamed of rallying his troops, of launching a final comeback. But his own marshals, the men who had fought beside him for years, turned against him. They knew the war was over. On April 6, 1814, under immense pressure, Napoleon finally abdicated. His empire was lost, his throne was gone. But even in defeat, he refused to kneel. Instead of execution, the victors offered exile. They sent him to Elba, a tiny island in the Mediterranean. It was a humiliating fate for a man who had once ruled half of Europe. But Napoleon was not broken. Even as he boarded the ship, he was already planning his return. He knew France was restless under the restored monarchy. The people still loved him. The soldiers still believed in him. And he had no intention of fading into history. This was not the end.
It was just the beginning of his greatest gamble yet. The gamble to reclaim everything he had lost.
1815. Napoleon had spent months in exile on the small island of Elba, watching from afar as France suffered under the restored monarchy of King Louis XIV. The people were disillusioned. The economy was weak, the army was demoralized, and the once mighty France felt like a nation in chains. Meanwhile, Napoleon was restless. He knew that as long as he lived, he remained a threat to the kings of Europe. He also knew that if he stayed in exile, he would eventually be forgotten. Or worse, assassinated. He had only one option left, to return and reclaim his throne. And so, on February 26, 1815, he escaped Elba with a small force of 1,000 men, sailing back to France, for what would become his most daring comeback. When he landed on the French coast, the government immediately sent troops to stop him. But something incredible happened. As Napoleon approached the soldiers, he stepped forward alone, opened his coat, and declared, "If any of you wish to kill your emperor, do it now." The soldiers, instead of arresting him, cheered and joined his side. Napoleon marched north, gathering supporters with every step. The legend of the eagle flying from Elba spread like wildfire. By the time he reached Paris, King Louis XVIII had fled. On March 20th, 1815, Napoleon re-entered the Tuileries Palace as emperor once more. The people welcomed him as a hero. It was one of the most astonishing returns in history. But he had little time to celebrate. Every king in Europe now saw him as a dangerous threat that had to be eliminated permanently. War was coming again, and this time it would be his last battle. Napoleon acted quickly. He knew that his only chance of survival was to strike first before the coalition could organize. He built a new army, but it was nothing like the massive force he once commanded. This time, he had only 200,000 men, facing a combined enemy force of over 800,000. His target? Belgium, where British and Prussian armies were stationed. If he could defeat them before the Austrians and Russians arrived, he had a chance. Moving fast, he crossed into Belgium in June 1815. His plan was brilliant. Divide the British and Prussian forces, defeat them separately, and force a peace treaty. On June 16th, he won a victory at Ligny, defeating the Prussians under Blücher, but his other forces under Marshal Ney failed to destroy the British at Quatre Bras. It was a costly mistake. 2 days later, on June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced Duke Wellington at the now legendary Battle of Waterloo. Everything was at stake. This was not just a battle, it was the fight for his empire, his legacy, and his very survival. June 18th, 1815. The battlefield of Waterloo was soaked in mud from the previous night's rain. Napoleon, confident but cautious, knew this was his final chance to reclaim his empire. Across the field stood Duke Wellington's British forces, reinforced by Dutch and Belgian troops. The Prussians, under Blücher, were still marching toward the battlefield, but for now, Napoleon had time. If he could break Wellington before the Prussians arrived, victory was his. He devised a plan to attack the center and weaken Wellington's defensive line while keeping his elite Imperial Guard in reserve for a final, crushing blow. His strategy was sound, but what he didn't know was that the gods of war had abandoned him that day. The battle began with a massive French artillery bombardment, but the wet ground absorbed much of the cannon fire, reducing its impact. Napoleon then ordered an attack on Hougoumont, a key farmhouse on Wellington's right flank. It was supposed to be a distraction,
But the British defenders, holding their ground fiercely, turned it into an all-out battle. As the French threw more and more troops into the fight, Wellington remained firm. He knew that Napoleon's real attack would come elsewhere. At midday, Napoleon launched his main assault, sending thousands of French infantry to storm Wellington's center. The British held their positions, using the terrain to their advantage. Each French charge was met with musket fire and bayonets. The fight was brutal, and casualties mounted on both sides. Then came Napoleon's biggest mistake. He believed Wellington was retreating and sent Marshal Ney with a massive cavalry charge. But Wellington had laid a trap. His infantry formed square formations, an unbreakable defense against cavalry. The French horsemen charged again and again, but they could not penetrate. Meanwhile, Blücher's Prussian forces finally arrived, hitting Napoleon's right flank. The French army was now fighting a battle on two fronts. Desperate, Napoleon played his final card. The Imperial Guard, his most elite soldiers. They marched forward in perfect formation, determined to break Wellington's lines. But the British and Prussian forces combined their firepower, tearing through their ranks. For the first time in history, the Imperial Guard broke and retreated. The sight of their best soldiers fleeing shattered the French army's morale. Panic spread, and soon the entire French force collapsed. Napoleon had lost. As night fell, Napoleon fled the battlefield, knowing his empire was finished. The dream of reclaiming France had died at Waterloo. The once invincible emperor was now a fugitive, hunted by the very nations he had once dominated. His return to power had lasted only 100 days. Now there was no exile to Elba, no second chance. The rulers of Europe wanted him gone, forever. The legend of Napoleon was about to face its final chapter.
Napoleon arrived in Paris, exhausted and defeated. The news of Waterloo had spread like wildfire, and the city that had once welcomed him as a hero now stood in silent fear. The French government, realizing that resistance was futile, turned against him. His closest allies, his own ministers, urged him to abdicate. For the second and final time, Napoleon resisted at first, believing he could still rally an army. But reality hit him hard. France was surrounded. The Prussians were marching toward Paris. The British demanded his surrender. And the French people, weary of war, no longer had the will to fight. With no options left, on June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated once again. This time, there would be no triumphant return. His enemies debated what to do with him. Execution was an option, but the British feared making him a martyr. Sending him back to Elba was out of the question. He had already escaped once. Instead, the British decided on a harsher punishment. Napoleon would be exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe. It was a place from which escape was impossible. On July 15, 1815, Napoleon boarded the HMS Bellerophon and surrendered to the British. His fate was sealed. As the ship sailed toward exile, he looked back at the land he had once ruled, knowing he would never see France again. For the next 6 years, Napoleon lived as a prisoner on St. Helena, watched over by British guards. His home, Longwood House, was damp, isolated, and surrounded by the vast, empty ocean. He spent his days dictating his memoirs, reflecting on his victories and defeats. The man who had once controlled the destiny of Europe was now a forgotten figure, trapped on a rock in the middle of the sea. His health declined, and the fire that had once burned within him slowly faded. Yet, even in exile, he remained defiant. He saw himself as a conqueror
undone by betrayal, not failure. As the years passed, the world began to move on. But the legend of Napoleon had only just begun.
By 1820, Napoleon's health had deteriorated rapidly. The once great conqueror, who had led armies across Europe, now struggled with constant pain, fatigue, and illness. Trapped on St. Helena, he was cut off from the world, surrounded only by a handful of loyal followers, and guarded by British soldiers who ensured he had no chance of escape. His enemies had not just exiled him. They had erased him from history, leaving him to wither in obscurity. He spent his final years writing his memoirs, trying to shape his legacy. Even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp. He dictated his own version of history, portraying himself as a misunderstood genius, a man betrayed by weak allies and vengeful monarchs. But deep down, he knew the truth. His ambition had led him to this lonely end. His condition worsened in early 1821. He suffered from severe stomach pain, nausea, and weight loss. Some suspected stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. Others believed he was being slowly poisoned by the British. The harsh climate, poor medical care, and the psychological torment of isolation had taken their toll. By May 1821, he could barely move. His famous energy, the force that had once shaken the world, was gone. On May 5, 1821, as a storm raged outside his small, damp house, Napoleon Bonaparte took his final breath. His last words, whispered with his fading strength, were, "France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine." Even in death, his thoughts were with his lost empire, his soldiers, and the woman he had once loved. Napoleon was buried on St. Helena in a simple, unmarked grave. The British feared that his body, if returned to France, would become a rallying symbol. But they underestimated the power of his legend. News of his death spread across Europe. And though his enemies celebrated, the people of France mourned. Napoleon was gone, but his story was far from over. Over time, his legend grew. He was no longer just a defeated emperor. He became a symbol of ambition, power, and destiny. In 1840, his remains were finally brought back to France, and he was laid to rest in Les Invalides, Paris, in a grand tomb fit for a king. The man who had once ruled Europe from a battlefield had found his place in history, not as a tyrant, but as one of the greatest military leaders the world had ever known. Napoleon's death was not the end of his story. His legacy, though marred by his downfall, lived on, shaping the course of history in profound ways. France, after years of turmoil, finally found stability under the restored monarchy of Louis-Philippe. But Napoleon's shadow loomed large. His name was still spoken with reverence and fear across Europe. Even his enemies, who had once fought to destroy him, had to acknowledge his brilliance. Historians and military leaders admired his strategies, his ability to inspire loyalty, and his unrelenting drive. Napoleon had not just been a conqueror, he had been a visionary, a man who changed the very structure of European politics. His Napoleonic Code, a set of civil laws he created, became the foundation for legal systems in many countries, from Italy to Latin America. It was one of his greatest achievements, ensuring that his influence would be felt long after his death. But Napoleon's legacy was not just about military victories or legal reforms. It was about the idea of the modern state, a state driven by ambition, centralized power, and a sense of destiny. His reign had marked the end of feudalism in many parts of Europe. He had spread the principles of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity across the continent, even if he had later become an emperor himself.
Under Napoleon, France became a symbol of power and pride. For many in the country, he was still the hero who had risen from nothing to build a vast empire. They remembered him not as a tyrant, but as a leader who had given France its place on the world stage. Even in the face of defeat, Napoleon's myth was unbreakable. In the years that followed, many tried to recreate his reign. His nephew, Napoleon III, would become the Emperor of France in 1852, seeking to revive the glory of his uncle. Though Napoleon III's reign was much less successful and ended with France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, it showed that Napoleon's dream of a French empire had never truly died. The idea of Napoleon as a symbol of national pride remained alive in the hearts of many. Across the world, people spoke of him as a legend, not just for his conquests, but for his relentless pursuit of power, his charisma, and his unyielding will to shape history. To this day, Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of the most debated figures in history. Praised as a hero, condemned as a tyrant, but never forgotten.
Napoleon's influence transcended the pages of history books. His life and deeds became a source of inspiration, fascination, and even controversy for generations. Artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians have drawn from his complex character, his rise and fall, to create some of the most iconic works in history. One of the most enduring images of Napoleon is that of the ambitious, determined man on horseback, often depicted in battle or surveying his vast empire. His military genius, his larger-than-life persona, and his dramatic downfall captured the imagination of not just the French, but the entire world. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Napoleon appeared in countless literary works, from Victor Hugo's Les Miserables to Tolstoy's War and Peace. He became a symbol of power and ambition, sometimes portrayed as a tragic hero, sometimes as a ruthless dictator. But in all cases, he was a figure who could not be ignored. On the silver screen, Napoleon's story has been told and retold in various forms. From silent films to epic blockbusters, his life has been immortalized in cinematic history. Perhaps the most famous film adaptation is Abel Gantz's 1927 silent film Napoleon, which presented a grand vision of his rise to power and used revolutionary filmmaking techniques to create a lasting impression. In the modern era, films like Stanley Kubrick's unmade film on Napoleon, which would have been one of the greatest ever made, show the continuing fascination with the man who once ruled over a continent. Even in television, Napoleon's life has been explored in miniseries and documentaries, delving into both his personal and political struggles. Each adaptation, whether through film, literature, or television, brings something new to his character, but they all share one thing: a recognition that Napoleon was no ordinary man. He had an enduring impact on world history that cannot be erased. Napoleon also found a place in modern popular culture, especially in the form of references, jokes, and metaphors. His name has become synonymous with ambition, strategy, and power, often used to describe anyone with a strong desire for dominance. The phrase Napoleon complex has entered the common lexicon, describing individuals with a perceived inferiority complex who compensate for their lack of height or power by acting aggressively. Even in video games and comic books, Napoleon appears as a character representing power and conquest, symbolizing human ambition at its highest and most dangerous form. Though many people today may not fully understand the historical significance of Napoleon, his image and legacy
remain a key part of the collective imagination.
Napoleon's influence on Europe is undeniable and lasting. While his empire may have crumbled, his policies, ideas, and actions shaped the future of the continent for generations. His most significant achievement was the spread of the Napoleonic Code, a set of civil laws that became the foundation for legal systems in many countries. The Napoleonic Code emphasized principles such as equality before the law, property rights, and the protection of individual freedoms. It abolished feudal laws and privileges, which had been in place for centuries, and established a more rational, uniform legal framework. The Napoleonic Code influenced the legal systems not only in Europe, but in places like Latin America, North Africa, and even parts of Asia, where countries looked to Napoleon's reforms as models for their own legal structures. The idea of the modern nation-state, with its centralized government and bureaucracy, was also a result of Napoleon's reign. In the wake of Napoleon's downfall, the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, sought to restore order to Europe and ensure that such an empire-building figure would never rise again. The balance of power was reset, with major European powers like Britain, Russia, and Austria seeking to limit the influence of France. However, the influence of Napoleon's ideas was already deeply embedded in the fabric of Europe. Even after his defeat, the old systems of monarchy and aristocracy found it difficult to undo the social and political changes he had brought about. Countries that had once been under Napoleon's control began to adopt more progressive policies, and the Napoleonic Wars paved the way for a new era of revolutionary movements and reforms across the continent. Napoleon's impact on the military was also profound. He revolutionized warfare by emphasizing speed, maneuverability, and decisive battles. His strategies and tactics are still studied in military academies around the world. His use of the corps system, where the army was divided into self-sustaining units that could operate independently, allowed for greater flexibility and efficiency. Napoleon's battlefield innovations, such as the use of artillery and the integration of infantry and cavalry, set the standard for future military campaigns. Even his enemies' strategies were shaped by the lessons learned from fighting Napoleon. Napoleon's life, marked by both extraordinary successes and catastrophic failures, transformed him into more than just a historical figure. Over time, his story became a myth, woven into the fabric of French culture and European history. While some remember him as a genius military leader, others view him as a power-hungry tyrant. Regardless of how he is perceived, Napoleon's myth has persisted for over 2 centuries. In France, his image is synonymous with national pride and ambition. He is seen as a man who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most powerful figures in history. Many French people view Napoleon not just as an emperor, but as a symbol of France's greatness during a time of upheaval. His military victories, such as Austerlitz, are still celebrated in the country, and his reforms continue to be admired for bringing modernization to French society. The idea that he was a man of destiny, whose rise to power was inevitable, still resonates with many. However, this myth has been complicated by Napoleon's downfall. His defeat at Waterloo, his exile to St. Helena, and his subsequent death in isolation have become integral parts of his story. Napoleon's ambition, which once made him a hero to many, ultimately led to his ruin. The myth of Napoleon is not just about the glory of his empire, but about the consequences of unchecked ambition. The French public's memory of his reign is often shaped by nostalgia for the days of glory.
when Napoleon seemed unstoppable. Yet, as time has passed, some have begun to question whether his personal ambitions caused more harm than good. Was he a liberator who brought revolutionary ideals to Europe, or a conqueror whose empire caused untold suffering? This complexity only adds to the allure of the Napoleonic myth. The myth of Napoleon is not confined to France. Across Europe, people view him through different lenses, as a symbol of tyranny and conquest, or as a heroic figure who reshaped the course of history. In Russia, his invasion is still remembered with bitterness, while in Germany, his defeat at Leipzig is seen as the beginning of a new era of German unity. Even in Britain, where he was long viewed as a dangerous adversary, Napoleon's brilliance as a military strategist is acknowledged. Over time, the man who was once seen as a villain became a figure of fascination for historians, artists, and filmmakers. Napoleon's myth has evolved into a story that transcends history and enters the realm of legend. A legend that continues to be debated, admired, and feared.
Napoleon Bonaparte's story, with all its triumphs and tragedies, continues to captivate the world centuries after his death. His life was one of extreme contrasts. From humble origins to becoming the emperor of a vast empire, and then from the heights of glory to the depths of defeat and exile. Yet, it is this very duality that keeps his story relevant. People are drawn to the complexity of his character, the ambition that drove him to greatness, yet also led to his downfall. His life serves as a powerful reminder that even the most powerful leaders are vulnerable to the forces of fate. Today, Napoleon is not only a historical figure, but a symbol of the human drive for power, glory, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. His life speaks to universal themes of leadership, sacrifice, and the cost of dreams that can sometimes be too big to achieve. Napoleon's story is more than just a series of military campaigns or political maneuverings. It is the story of a man who dared to reshape the world, who believed that he could change the course of history. Even in his defeat, he left an indelible mark on the world. His influence on the legal, political, and military systems of Europe cannot be overstated. But beyond the battles and policies, Napoleon's life is a narrative of ambition, power, and legacy. He remains a subject of endless fascination, with his name constantly evoked in discussions about leadership, strategy, and personal determination. As the centuries pass, Napoleon's myth continues to evolve, but his presence is unshakable. He remains one of the most iconic figures in history, a symbol of the heights that human ambition can reach, and the dangers it can bring. Whether you view him as a hero, a villain, or something in between, there is no denying the powerful legacy he left behind. Napoleon's story is a timeless reminder of how the dreams of one man can alter the fate of nations, and how history can be shaped by both victories and defeats. For all of us, his life provides valuable lessons about the choices we make, the risks we take, and the costs of striving for greatness. Napoleon Bonaparte may have fallen, but his influence on history, politics, and culture is forever etched into the annals of time. His story remains a testament to the power of ambition and a reminder of the fragile nature of glory. As we reflect on Napoleon's life, remember that every rise and fall teaches us something important about leadership, destiny, and the pursuit of our dreams. Never forget the power of ambition, but also remember the price it can exact. Stay determined, but always grounded.